Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Frances Shefter, Principal of Shefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.shefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Frances Shefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today's special guest is Lisa Quinn, who is the founder and director of Reach Every Voice and co-founder of Communication for Education. And I'm really excited to have Lisa on because this has been a hot topic around lately about AAC devices and communication, because it's such a need and an area that is so not very well known to the school system, right, Lisa? So tell us a little bit about what you do and where it came about.
Yeah, it is a hot topic lately. So thanks, Frances. Thanks for having me here. So I am by trade, I am a public school educator. I spent 15 years working in Maryland public schools. And after grad school, I took a job working specifically in an AAC inclusion program. So my students were all in grades 2 to 5. They had dynamic display devices. So this was a long time ago. They're not the iPads you see now. iPads weren't a thing then, but they were these, chunky devices that had multiple layers. Students would be able to select a button in some way and access voice output. So these look different for every student, right? And they've come such a long way now, right? It used to be such a barrier was just the technology piece, and technology has come so far, which should make it easier, right? That should be one thing that's making it easier for our students. And yet we're still struggling. We're still seeing students denied access to communication devices in a lot of ways. But so I spent time in public elementary schools supporting students with communication devices, accessing same curriculum as their peers. And then I've also supported students who were denied access to general education curriculum and needed access to these devices and were not necessarily always given access, or they were given maybe a trial on it and they were deemed inappropriate candidates, right? By some powers that be. They were said, you know what, you're not really an AAC user. We've made that decision for you. So it's a long time to spend in a school system where, my whole goal entering was like, I'm going to enact change from within.
Right.
We talked about this.
That's how we all started teaching, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be the one. I'm going to make the change. And when you feel it going from like, I'm going to make change to I'm going to shut my door and do what's right for my kids. And you felt like you had to be like, I'm just going to shut my door and do what's right over here. And that becomes the thing you do day after day. And I know when we talked about like that moment, right? Having that moment when ooh, this is it. I got to get out, right? We've all had those I've got to get out moments. Sadly, more than one, I did get out. I left. And I never thought that would be me. So I left teaching. And I did it kind of gradually. It was first I went part-time and then I left completely. So when I left part-time, I began Reach Every Voice. So Reach Every Voice began as a group program. I was working with a group of non-speaking autistic students who had, for most of their lives, been denied access to communication, been denied access to education. And then they got it through a pilot program. There were maybe about 6 of them who were given access to the supports they needed, the trained supports they needed, and the school system. But it still wasn't everything, right? There was still the layers of bureaucracy. There's still the layers of like, what happens when your trained supports aren't there? Are we training backups? Probably not. You probably don't need that, right? What are you going to do in the summer? Do you qualify for summer services? Probably not, even though we should go through the checklist. We probably just won't do it, with fidelity. So my students, what they really wanted was they wanted a place where they could connect with their peers, where they could continue building communication skills, and where they could learn the things that they wanted to learn and have fun. And so that's how Reach Every Voice started. We were a summer program for 6 students. And so we started out, we met in someone's basement, and then we started renting space in schools, and we grew from there, right? Our students were like, can we do this throughout the school year? Okay, why not, right? Let's do it on the weekends. Yeah. And then we had more people saying, well, could my child learn to communicate like these children? Yeah, why not, right? Let's keep going. And so that's kind of how we organically grew. So this is our 10th year in business. And it's wild to me because we kind of feel like a startup. A lot of our students who are with us have been with us for the whole journey. And as you can imagine, now they're adults and they don't need the same things they needed when they were 12, 13, right? Now they're 22, 23. So we're constantly evolving to figure out, how do we change? How do we support them? But as we build this growing community of learners, we're realizing, hey, there's a lot we can do to continue spreading communication supports and to continue helping to enact change from without, because I'm not in the system anymore. And so now it's, how do I support the learners who come to us? And how do we continue talking and spreading ideas, working with the people who will collaborate with us to like make the change in the systems and the ways that we can around us.
Yeah, because I mean, the AAC devices, the average person doesn't know. I mean, we don't know a lot about them. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what's available. I've had several cases where, oh, well, he doesn't know how to use the AAC device. So it sits behind us, or he doesn't use it appropriately. So we don't let him have it. And the aid wasn't there, so he couldn't use it because the aid wasn't there, and all of these excuses of why to not. And I'm just flabbergasted, because this is the only way this child can communicate. And we need to teach this child how to communicate, because unfortunately, what I see often in our country is that if you can't communicate in English without the accent in the way that we normal conventional English, then you're not smart, right? And all of that is that because that's the only way, for the most part, we rely on, is that communication. And for our kids that don't have the verbal communication yet, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what they know because we haven't gotten it out. And it always brings me back to Helen Keller, right? With, until she had, what was her name? Anne Sullivan, I think, that taught her how to communicate. She was brilliant, right? But she was written off because she was blind and deaf and couldn't talk because she didn't have any of those senses. And it just amazes me that today still our school system doesn't adapt to help these kids learn how to communicate. Right?
You said so many things there. So many things that to come back to. It's like a whole hour in that one sentence, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the idea of we don't know what they know because they can't communicate, right? And that's a huge problem. A lot of parents, I read about it in Facebook groups. I read about it and I talk to parents who come to us. Parents are being asked, or maybe not, sometimes not even asked. They're being kind of nudged rather forcefully towards making a decision at a very young age to remove their children from a diploma path, right? They're being told your child will be better served in this specialized program. We can provide better services. We can provide more specialized supports. We can help them better in a alternative curriculum framework.
Right. But even worse than that is what the schools are telling the parents is this isn't taking them off the high school diploma track. It's just putting them in alternative learning outcomes for now because they'll be better served. But what they don't tell the parents is you're now taking a kindergartner that's a year behind, taking him off general education curriculum and putting him into this other class. So now he's going to spend 3 years in there of not getting general education curriculum. So where do you think a kindergartner on a preschool level is now, having not had any of that curriculum? They're never going to catch up, and they're never going to be, even though they're not determining the high school diploma track, there's no way of getting back on again because you're that many years behind, right?
In the 15 years I was in public schools, there was one instance, and it was extraordinary circumstances. There was one instance where a student was moved, like on my caseload, where a student was moved from a non-diploma track back to a diploma track. It's a one-way street, and nobody explains that to parents. And I think a thing that parents also don't understand is, you know, now, especially, like, this has been a bigger conversation, right? With the decision-making tool. So I'm in Maryland here with you, right? One of the things in Maryland we talk about with this conversation with the decision-making tool of, are we making the right decision, is the idea of communicative competence is a huge piece of, can we make this decision with like good faith, right? To make the decision to move the child off. And if a kid doesn't have a means to communicate, to reliably show us what they know, we can't make that decision, right? And you're saying, and like one of the questions is, have they had like consistent, reliable, rigorous, thorough instruction in the use of alternative communication? And if your device is locked in a closet because somebody's afraid you're going to break it, the answer is no, right? If you're walking in classrooms and they're saying, well, the aide wasn't here to show them, the answer is no. If your intervention is only with a speech pathologist for 45 minutes, one time a week, the answer is no, right? So kids need time to watch people use the device without any expectation of using it. Just watch other people use it, right? The other thing that I've been talking about with a lot of people lately is like you had said, they don't want to use it. Because I'll hear people say that, well, they don't want to use it. They have no interest in using it. Okay. Like I mean, number one, maybe that's not true, but also maybe they don't right now. Like they need time to learn to accept it. Like, I was listening to a webinar from an adult AAC user, someone who uses it part-time. She uses her speech sometimes, and she uses an AAC device. And she talked about how much personalized, like internalized resistance she had to it. And like she had to overcome it because, like you said, as a society, we judge people by how they talk, how they speak, right? That's how we judge people's intelligence. And so she had to think like, well, if I'm using this device, people aren't going to treat me as they would treat everybody else, right? And so she had to get past that for herself as an adult, right? She had like a PhD at the time. And if that's what we're expecting from somebody with a PhD, how are we expecting a 6-year-old to have that level of self-awareness?
Exactly. And a 6-year-old in a classroom, which nobody else is using this. They've never, I mean, so if you look at like the history of or like the developmental milestones of learning how to speak, you're seeing it all modeled. And you're hearing it all modeled, and you're seeing your parents do it, and you're seeing your neighbors do it, and your siblings do it, and your family do it, and all that other stuff. But these kids have never seen the AAC device. They don't understand it. They've never seen it. Nobody's modeled it for them. They're not being encouraged to use it. So of course they're not going to use it because to them it's just another thing. And people complain, oh, well, when we give them the AAC device, they figure out how to go to YouTube or do to this or go to that. Well, because that's all they know about these devices. That's all they've ever seen people use them for, right?
Yeah. And they need models of it. Like they need to see it, and like they need to see it in their picture books, right? And there's some really great books. There's this book called More Than Words by an author called Roz McLean. Oh my gosh. This is one that like I took my son was 4 years old at the time, and his little preschool was doing something about community helpers. And so they asked parents to come in and talk about what you do. And I brought this book in, and the whole book, the premise of the book is like, we communicate in so many different ways, so many different beautiful ways. And there's 3 or 4 AAC users in this book. Can you imagine if every classroom had books with AAC users in them, right? We're seeing that representation. And it's just a normalized part of like what we're doing. Have you ever seen a teacher with an AAC device? I mean, most people haven't.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you my friend Jordan Zimmerman's a teacher. She has a documentary about her called This Is Not About Me. If you haven't seen it, it's a must watch. But who has seen these things, right? These are things that people need to see. They need to understand that there are humans everywhere using these devices to help them. And once that becomes like a normalized part of our culture, that'll take some steps too towards helping our kids.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I know like asking in Montgomery County, it's the Hyatt, but asking for assistive technology observations. But even then, like I had them say to me one time, oh, well, they're not even able to match a picture with that real object. Right. And so an AAC device isn't appropriate. Well, how do you know that? Because matching a picture to a real object is one mode, and they're not doing that mode. That doesn't mean they won't do an AAC mode. Like, it's not like, oh, if you can't do this, then you can't do that. But that's how they're using it. They're saying, oh, well, you need to use low tech first before we can move to high tech. Why? Yeah. It's not like you have to learn, like driving a car. It's not like you have to learn to drive on like one of those little kiddie cars first, right? And then another. It's just you learn how to drive a car, and that's it.
It's a good analogy. It's actually like a good analogy in a lot of ways. One thing I've learned from working with, so a lot of the students I work with now specifically are autistic. And, you're bringing about this idea of like a specific thing, like matching a picture to a real object. And that's a motor planning task, right? That's asking you to execute a very specific like motor thing. Take this, put it with this. And a lot of students I know are denied access to AAC, or they're said they can't use them. They're unable to communicate. Their intelligence is very low. They're low functioning because they're unable to execute complex motor tasks, right? And I think for me, a huge shift in my understanding came about when I stopped viewing autism as an intellectual disability, even a communicative disability, and started viewing it as a motor impairment. Mm-hmm. So my students now, what I've realized is like, some of my students, I might say, hey, match this picture to this real item. And that might be really hard. But they're able to, once they've learned a motor pattern, they're able to communicate with that, right? So they spell, they type to communicate. But it's been this idea of understanding that they're impacted by apraxia. And this apraxia is this idea that their brains and their bodies aren't talking to each other, right? It's this motor disorder, and it is like a brain and a body disconnect. One of my students describes it as his brain and his body are operating, they're on different operating systems. Like his brain is a Mac and his body is a PC, right? Yeah. And so what's helped me, like I have this little guy, and when you look at him, like let's say he's lying on the floor. We would look at this child in a classroom and say, he doesn't want to engage. He's non-compliant. He's not interested, right? Maybe he's seeking a different sensory thing. And so people might say, get up, sit in your chair, stand up, and he's not following through with it. It looks like an active choice on his part to not get up.
Right.
One thing I've learned is I need to be far more specific in how I coach his body to do that, and to say like, hey, put your hands flat on the floor. Good. Now push, 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 push with your strong arms. Push, push, push. Okay, now bring your knees up under. Okay, you're on your knees. Now push back onto your heels. Push back onto your heels. Good. Now bring your weight back. Now stand up, push up. Great. Put your hands on your chair. And like sometimes even more than that. And then get in the chair. And you know what? Then he's in the chair and we're moved on. And it wasn't that he didn't want to get up. It's that his body was stuck. And so all of that transfers to using a device.
I never even thought of that, but it totally makes sense. Because it's, I talk a lot about autism with PDA profile, because that's like the thing now. And it's, people are like, oh, well, it's school refusal. It's like, no, it's not. Most PDAers want to go to school. They desperately want to, but their nervous system is so shut down, they can't physically get there. And so what do we do, and how do we communicate that, and what can we do? And that's the whole thing, is like teaching these kids communication through emotions, through other things, and how to adjust their systems. I never even thought of that, of like a kid not standing up. It has nothing to do with him not wanting to stand up. It's having to do with that auditory processing maybe, or just the mind-body connection that his body doesn't, like, he doesn't know how to do that.
Right. And
It's too much. You need the task analysis. Yeah, you need
it
each
needs
step.
to be broken into smaller pieces for him. And like, there are days where I very specifically say, like, I understand, like, you are that was an example. Like, I'm thinking in that case, I'm thinking about like a 5-year-old, but I have sometimes 15-year-olds who might need that same kind of coaching. And I make it explicitly clear, like, listen, I'm going to talk to your brain like you're a 15-year-old. I'm going to speak to you like you're 15 and you understand me. However, your body needs a little more help today. Your body needs some more coaching. And so I'm going to break it down for your body. And then we're going to get up and we're going to go back to whatever it was we were talking about. And so with regards to communication, like, we very specifically go back to thinking about motor planning with that, right? We work very purposefully on the movement piece of, like, reliably making a choice between two things with known answers so that I can prompt you when your body's not doing the right thing, right? Like, it's not that I'm asking you something that has a unknown answer. I know what the answer is. If your body moves to the wrong thing, I'm going to teach you and we're going to practice moving to the right thing. And then we're going to continue a progression like any other skill you learn, right? We're going to scaffold it up a hierarchy of things getting harder while I work down prompts. It's like not rocket science. It's like good teaching, right? Combined with its understanding of a motor system. And also assuming that my kids are smart, because that's a piece that the schools miss, is that if we're viewing our non-speaking students, if we're viewing them as cognitively disabled, we're not providing them with real instruction.
Right. And the problem is that all of our IQ tests, even the nonverbal IQ test, it's not.
And it's all motor based. If you don't have a reliable motor system, no amount of, like, if you take the speech part away, you're still relying on somebody who has an intact motor system.
Right. Of stacking the blocks. Right.
Stacking the blocks, pointing to the picture. Right.
Yeah. It's so flawed. It's so flawed because it doesn't give you, I mean, we could go on and on about the whole IQ thing to begin with, but it's like, again, it's where society is and what we think. And people, they assume nonverbal, autism, Down syndrome are all kids that have intellectual disabilities as well. And I would say more often than not, it's not intellectual disabilities as well. It's just that communication piece that we haven't tapped into. And it keeps bringing me back to that meme of, if a flower can't grow, we don't change the flower, we change the environment the flower is in. And that is like what we need to do with our kids. Like, they're not learning, they're not progressing. What can we do to help support them so that they can learn and progress? Which is bring the AAC device in, do the constant, and maybe the AAC device doesn't work for this child. Okay, so let's find what other way. Maybe sign language is better. Maybe, whatever it is, but like, not just write these kids off because they can't speak.
And maybe it isn't just an AAC device. Like, we encourage, or maybe it's not just an AAC device. Maybe it's AAC plus low tech plus speech plus sign. Like, maybe it's multimodal communication, right? A lot of times people don't understand that there is such a thing as a part-time AAC user. Like, some people may speak and rely on AAC in other situations, right? Like, I always think back to, Barry Prezant. He's a speech language pathologist. He wrote Uniquely Human. It's like a different way of looking at autism. It was one of the first books I read that was like, oh, aha, right? And so he talks about multimodal communication and its importance as being something we use when we don't have access to our highest means of communication. Like, when I am dysregulated, and I think about this like in terms where I'm stressed, when I'm frustrated, when I'm angry, and this is me as a person who uses speech as my primary means of communication, I don't have access to my best communication, right? So I rely on other things in those times. All of our students deserve that. They deserve to have access to a range of communication options, because when they are sick, when they're distressed, when they have a lack of sleep, right, and they can't access whatever their highest means is, they deserve to have something to fall back on. So if there's somebody who uses speech but still benefits from AAC, they should still have access to that.
Right. No, it's so true. I don't even think about that. looking back at IEPs, I see all of the time using multimodal communication. What does that mean? You know what I mean?
Right.
What does that mean? I can guarantee, and I'm going to try it at the next IEP meeting. What does that mean?
Can you tell me what that looks like?
Right. Because the speech, I will tell you right now, I know the SLP, the speech language pathologist, will be able to tell, but all the other teachers and all the other service providers have no clue what that means and what it looks like for this child. And I had a case on this one time, and the speech teacher is like, oh yeah, so this is how I do it. And he's making so much progress in speech. I'm like, so why haven't you taught that to the teacher and the aide that works with him for the rest of the 30 some odd hours of the week? Oh, okay. And that's the problem, is that the speech teachers know exactly what they're doing and know how to make the progress, but they're not teaching the aides and the teachers how to do it. And so the kid's not making progress. An average person reading a IEP with multimodal communication, what does that look like for this child? Some kids, it might be sign language. It might be the AAC device. It might be, I'll date myself, the PEX devices. Board Maker was what I used on a VHS.
Yeah.
Like, that's to really date myself of what the communicate, but that's what they had back then, and other ways to communicate. And what does this child need? How does this child need to communicate? And thinking now, like, to my IEPs, I'm like, I don't know if I've written great IEPs with that for my non-communicators, right?
Well, I mean, I'll be the first to say, like, I've learned so much from my students now, right? The ones who didn't always have access to communication and now do. I mean, of course I would change things I've done in the past. I don't think what I learned in grad school was the best thing, right? I think we have a lot of work to do with, like, changing how we educate educators coming into the field. Because I don't think I don't think that anybody is trained well enough to come in and take over the things that are getting dumped on them right now.
And they're not even taught how to write IEPs.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most amazing thing, you know, like you should see what I see in some of these IEPs. I'm like, huh?
I know.
You know, like, it's scary. And it's frustrating. I would say also, like, I don't know if I cut you off or not, but like, that we see central office comes in, and central office knows how to write the IEPs and they fix it. But I'm like, why isn't central office doing in-services for all the case managers on how to write an IEP appropriately? What language to use, right?
I feel like it's a very big and multi-layered problem that's impacting special ed across the nation, right? I mean, on a micro level here in MCPS, there's a lot, right? There's shortages of teachers. There's obvious shortages of teachers. There's overwhelming, like, people's caseloads are bursting at the seams. People quit in the middle of the year. Like, all of those are realities. And at the same time, should the kids be suffering because of it? No, of course not. Right. So what's the fix for it? I don't know. I don't have the answer for that. Right.
Right.
Everybody's underfunded. What's the answer?
And that's the problem I have often, is that we know that there's a wrongdoing, and we know that the FAPE is being denied and whatever it is, but what is the remedy? And if I don't have a remedy, I don't have a case to file for due process, because you have to have a remedy. And so it's where our school system now is, we need to be pushing for that change to help these kiddos and the resources are there, in the sense of, I can guarantee, I know, and I'm sure you know from our teaching days, if somebody had taught me a different way of doing things, I would have jumped on it. You know, I remember when I taught my kids, I mean, back then it was profound mentally handicapped, but my kids with the IQs below 40, because they didn't know how to. And I remember designing a computer program for them, and doing a grant for a touchscreen computer, because back then we didn't have touchscreen computers, of teaching them and making it, and my kids learning. And I remember, like, administration going, wow, I didn't know they could learn like that. Because nobody gave them that opportunity and how to do it. Whereas, and that's the thing, is like, that teachers, And I don't blame teachers at all, because we also know of like they're overloaded. Their caseloads are ridiculous. They're already working nights and weekends when they're supposedly not supposed to, and there's only so much they can do. And as you said, the same thing I did is shut my door and do what I want to do with my children and be alone. And that works to an extent sometimes, but sometimes you can't because you don't have an administration that will allow that. You have people that are in your face more often. And I hate saying what's the solution, but the solution is for the parents to go out and see what's there, and find out and say, oh, can we get an assistive technology consultation? There's a department within MCPS, and I can guarantee in almost every county, there's some sort of department that's assistive technology, and teaching the parents to say, hey, we need to do this. My child's not. This is what works for my child at home in the ways of communication. How can we implement that in the school?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's super important. You mentioned Hyatt earlier. When I was in MCPS, it's also Interact. So there were two departments involved in it, right? Yeah, so important. I mean, and I guess the other thing is to, gosh, it's a lot on parents, right? It's a lot for parents to have to take on and to be aware of. Like for me, one thing that's important is like, I'm assuming these are like your audience is probably a lot of parents who are parents of children with disabilities. I would hope that like the more we continue to speak about this, the more that like we share this in other networks, like we're growing advocacy networks too, right? Yeah. Because it shouldn't just be on the parents of kids with disabilities to be making these points, right? I think it's super important for, as we work within like school PTAs, for example, like those are our school communities. I hope our school communities can become more inclusive. Maybe our PTAs can be sources of support. Maybe our PTAs can be places where we say, hey, how can we support you in your efforts and advocacies? Because like for me, it's a big thing. I work with so many parents who are just like, they're at the end of like their mental energy on everything, right? I'm sure those are your parents too, right? This is like one more thing. And to have to go in and advocate for one more thing, they need their parents, their friends who are not in those shoes to be the ones who start to pull in and like help with that heavy lifting. It needs to be the other community. For it to truly be an inclusive school community, we need the parents of non-disabled kids to speak up and start advocating for that as well.
Right. It reminds me of, I remember back in elementary school, we had a deaf student, and I'll date myself even more. I don't know if you even know about cued speech, but it was something, way back when that was a way of teaching to speak. And I remember wanting to learn so that I could communicate with this child. And the school, I don't remember how, but the school taught it to us. And so so that we could communicate with this child in the way the child could communicate with us. And it was great. And it was because, again, that was bringing it to us. So the AAC device isn't only, these communication devices aren't only for the child using it, it's for the receivers as well. Mm-hmm. And maybe we need to have a class for all, a class for the entire class. Like, hey, this child communicates differently. This is how, and this is how we communicate, and this is how to use the device, and this is how to communicate with the child.
Or as we're talking about like a movie night for a PTA, could we consider there's a new one on Disney Plus, right? My gosh, is it Out of My Mind? Is that the
Inside Out?
I'm blanking it. No, it's the one with the girl with her communication device, the little girl with cerebral palsy.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Totally blanking on the name. I think it's either Out of My Mind or I think it's Out of My Mind. I'll
have to look
it up. But like choosing more inclusive movies, right? As a school, as you're doing planning activities, what does that look like, right? How is that a part of our community? If you have a parent who's in a forceful struggle over or even just I'm thinking about school musicals, right? Or concerts. How are we making sure these kids are included as we go and play on our PTA bingos, our school musicals? Are they included? Do we see our special education students showing up there? If not, start asking why. Why aren't they showing up there?
Right.
Yeah.
And what do we do to include them? It's so true.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a lot of where this show came about, is because I just so many times heard from parents, like, I didn't even know people like you existed, talking about me as an education attorney and advocate. Parents didn't know. And I think back to being a new parent, and even with my degrees and all of my experience and stuff, it's still overwhelming. And then you get the neurodiverse diagnosis. And then what? Who do you talk to? Who do you turn to? If your support network has never been involved, they don't know where to go. And so how do we reach out to other parents? And that's why parent groups I'm very active in, of like, hey, here's a video on this, and if you want information on something else, let me know. I'll find somebody and have them on my show. But again, I love that you're saying is like the PTA needs to get involved. So Montgomery County has, and I forgot what it's like, it's the Montgomery County Special Needs PTA. Well, why is it separate?
Why is it separate?
Get it I get it that there's different needs, and but it should be with everybody else as well. Not like a committee of the whole, not a separate group.
Right. And I'm sure there are individual schools, like when you go from school to school, some schools do inclusion. Right? Oh my God.
Yeah.
But some schools support their students really well, right? Some schools really do. And some schools really don't. And I imagine there are some PTAs that consider these things as they go about supporting their communities. And I'm sure there are some schools who haven't. It hasn't even crossed their mind. Right.
Yeah. And the trainings and stuff. Now I'm like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm calling my PTA people, but it's true.
It's true, right? Like, it's one more thing that parents shouldn't have to take on. Like, there is a network of parents like organized and ready to like organize a fundraiser. Like, let's get them on this too. Let's get them building a better, stronger school community,
right?
For everybody in their school.
Correct. Like, I don't know, as a parent of my kids, and I'm relatively involved with a lot of parents. I have 2 kids in the same school in different grades. But I don't know if there's families that are being left out for certain reasons. And so that's a conversation I need to have with the PTA. Maybe we need to send a survey out to the kids of like, hey, how can we support you? How can we help you be a part of our community? And then, I mean, I know as a parent with 2 neurodiverse kids, that would be huge for me as well. Of like, this is what I need for my kid to be able to function in these social environments. I know for a lot of us, okay, we have a dance or an after school activity. Well, the only way our kids are participating is if we're there with them.
Right.
Because we know if something happens, how to handle, and the other people don't. And so,
and if that's the case, then my question would be maybe not what do your kids need, but then if you're going to be there too, what do you need to make it enjoyable for you? Right.
Right. Exactly.
Right. It's a trickle down effect of like, let's make the planning continue to grow and to be like more inclusive and more supportive.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because my kid went to one dance and something happened and she got dysregulated and I got called to come pick her up early, which is fine. Of course I'll do it. But then I'm like, well, maybe I'll just stay at all of them, because if it happens, I can at least maybe help regulate her so she can continue to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Right. But it's just like another thing of what do we do? And it reminds me of, we went to, and this is like the outside community, take it even more. We went to a Taylor Swift party, something or other. And the rooms were small. It was very tight rooms, very loud. And my daughter got completely dysregulated. A lot of the parents were like, oh, let's go out for a drink. We can drop the kids off. I'm like, yeah, no, I can't. I knew it. And she got very dysregulated at the early and went to run out. And of course, somebody physically stopped her because they didn't see me coming. And I was like, I got her. She's mine, and she was just so upset because she so wanted to be a part of that group. She loved Taylor Swift. She wanted to be a part of the group, but she physically, there was just too much. And I remember talking to one of the people that ran it. She's like, that opened my eyes. We need to have a quiet room that maybe has a Taylor Swift activities, but not with the loud music, playing it softly, and have a quiet room so that they can be included. I'm like, that is a great idea. Yep. And that's the thing of like outside community. Like, what can we do to support these kids? It shouldn't be all on the parents. It should be it's also teaching our children. That's the other thing I look at. It's like teaching our children to be inclusive and to be accepting, you know, of like, all kids are different. We all communicate different. We all do things differently. How can we bring them in? I love it because like this conversation went totally not where I was thinking it was going to go, right? Like, but I feel like, but that's why I love this show. And like, I always say to people, like, this is just like, let's see where the conversation goes. Because like, for me, I feel for listeners, especially, like, this is, you know, these might be the questions they're asking. Like, well, what else do you expect me to do? I have a lot of listeners that might not have kids with communication disorders, but now, oh, wait a minute. Okay. I do know there is somebody in my class that has a communication. Let me reach out to that parent and see how I can support. Like, how can we do a play date? You know, and how can we support you and be helpful? But yeah, it's just, there's so much out there. And again, like as I always say, I never put it on the teachers. I never blame teachers because they have too much on their plates.
It's a lot.
It's hard for parents. I don't blame parents either. You know, we're doing the best we can with the knowledge that we have at this point in time. And in 2 years, if we have more knowledge, we'll do something differently, you know, and like, I look back at, you know, oh my God, I can't believe I made that decision. But at that point in time, it was the best decision with what I knew. Mm-hmm. And so it's not, you know, parents, you're doing the best you can. We got you, you know, we get it. Here's some things, you know, some pointers of how to help others, you know, help you basically interact. Right. So what are, I don't know, I want to kind of wrap up here because I know I'm watching the clock because I know we both have 1 o'clocks. So, right. So like, what are some things like for parents, like, or our listeners, what would be like your top tips, takeaways that you would want parents to know?
I would say if your child is not speaking, ask for an AAC consult. Learn as much as you can about AAC. If your child is autistic, learn as much as you can about apraxia. Literacy skills are for everybody. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't teach your child to read. We're actually, we're starting tomorrow. One of my teachers here is a Wharton Gillingham instructor who is also works with non-speaking students. And so we're offering a phonics for non-speakers workshop. It starts tomorrow. Wow. It's a 6-week workshop. And so we've got a bunch of people already signed up, but like, this is a hot thing, right? Because people don't know if my child can't speak, how can I teach them reading? How can I teach them phonics? So I would say explore literacy for them. You can reach out to us at Reach Every Voice if you feel like you would like more support with those things. You know, and I would say, don't let anybody nudge you or push you off of a diploma track. If that's not, like, if you feel it in your heart that your child is not in that place, don't do that.
Yeah. And I always say with the alternative learning outcomes is that even if you think your child might need it before 3rd grade, they're too young.
It's like, way too young.
It's just, and what I do want to put out there that parents might not know is if you do not agree to ALO, the school system has to provide non-ALO options.
Yes. And I would also say that they do not always tell you, if you do not sign that form, they will still put your child in ALO. You have to sign it in disagreement, right? Correct. You must sign that you disagree, because they might just fail to tell you that. You think you're dissenting by not signing it. Yeah.
Right, because there's two different areas. It's one, I understand what this means and agree that my child should be on alternative learning. And then the other one is I'm agreeing to my child being placed in an alternative learning. So you could actually agree with the ALO, but then not agree with them being in a place for that.
Well, you can say you explained it to me and I don't agree.
Yes.
But if you say I refuse to sign this, they can still stick your child in ALO if you don't sign it, right?
Exactly.
One more thing related to that, when the pandemic happened and all of my parents were like, oh my God, like all parents were like, oh my God, right? We have our kids and I'm seeing firsthand what this education looks like, or I have no idea what to do with them. We created a 10-week course. It's 10 modules now because it's not being offered live. It's just kind of living in the archives, but it's me with a document camera showing people how to take a grade level objective, so it's aligned to Common Core, and how to make it accessible for a non-speaking student. So like how to take a tall tale and what I would do with that for someone who's just making choices. Because that's another thing is people will say, well, we can't adapt this for somebody who doesn't speak. We can't adapt this for somebody who's making choices. Yes, you can. And so this course is called Accessible Academics, and it lives on our website. And it's low cost. It's $100 for lifetime access to 10 different academic areas of how to adapt.
Wow. That is awesome.
Academics.
So what's your website? Let's get that out there so people can.
Sure. Our website is www.reacheveryvoice.org. We are located physically in Gaithersburg, Maryland. We do have sort of a satellite office out towards the Annapolis area. And we serve folks globally around the world. We'll travel and meet people wherever we are.
That is so awesome. And all your contact information is on the website. Yeah. So this has been so great. I feel like we could keep talking for hours and hours and hours, right?
Good. Yeah. No, thank you, Frances. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been so informative for me personally, and I'm sure for all of our listeners.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Stress-Free IEP with your host, Frances Shefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Frances through schefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.